hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid.
All right, welcome back to The Hybrid. I'm Erik Gundersen here with Shawn Collins, and today we're digging into a part of the cannabis industry that most people never see, but without it, the system simply doesn't work. When people talk about cannabis reform, they usually focus on licensing, social equity, tax rates, or maybe even interstate commerce. What gets far less attention is what's happening after the sale and how that money actually moves through the system where cannabis remains federally illegal. That gap between state legality and federal prohibition creates real risk, not theoretical. Today's episode sits at the intersection of cannabis banking, armored cash logistics, civil forfeiture, and a regulatory patchwork that often puts compliant businesses in difficult positions. Our guest today, Deirdra O'Gorman, CEO and president of Empyreal Logistics, runs a company that operates in the middle of all that tension. Empyreal provides compliant first cash and transit services to licensed cannabis businesses across the country, working with regulators, banks, and law enforcement, while also dealing with the reality that crossing a state line can still mean serious exposure, even when every dollar is clean and accounted for. Empyreal's story matters because it highlights a core truth about cannabis policy in the United States. Even when states do everything right, write thoughtful laws, license responsibly, and enforce compliance, federal law still looms over the industry. That disconnect shows up most clearly in cannabis banking, and even more starkly when you start talking about armored vehicles being stopped, cash being seized, and companies having to fight the federal government to get legally earned dollars back. We're going to talk today about how cannabis cash actually moves, what compliance looks like on the ground, why civil forfeiture remains a real threat for legitimate operators, and what regulators often misunderstand about this part of the cannabis ecosystem. I'll add this conversation is especially timely. We're recording this episode on Friday, December 12th, and in the last couple of days, there's been reporting and speculation that the Trump administration could move cannabis to Schedule 3. If that happens, it would be a meaningful shift, but it would not magically solve the issues we're discussing today. Schedule 3 does not equal legalization. It does not automatically open the banking system, and it does not eliminate law enforcement risk overnight. Companies like Empyreal would still be operating in a space between federal policy and practical reality. But before we get into introducing our guest, obviously my co-host, my friend, Shawn Collins, how are you, sir?
Good, thanks. Good to see you.
Did you like my speech? My opening speech?
I liked your cadence. Your pace was good. I'm sure there were a few paws in there,
I've been working on a lower tone too.
Yeah.
So good. Excited for this conversation. And Deirdra, first of all, thank you so much for joining us on the hybrid. Excited for this conversation. Hope you're well in this holiday season. But I want to ask, bringing you on here, just a little bit of your backstory. Tell our listeners a little bit about your professional journey, how you entered cash in transit and financial service logistics, and really when you created Empyreal, what did you see? What was the driving factor behind starting that company?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. Well, my story is like everybody's story in cannabis. It goes sideways and upside down and a lot of different twists and turns. So I actually was a banker by trade. I had been in the banking industry for 20 plus years, and Colorado decided to, break up disrupt the ecosystem and go adult use. And so in 2012, 2013, it was a dumpster fire, to be frank, with what we were going to do with all that cash. And not a lot of financial institutions were stepping up at the time to say, yes, please allow us to do all the enhanced due diligence and be scrutinized by regulators and FinCEN. And so the then governor at the time decided to create a think tank to try to figure out this cash issue. And I was part of that group of individuals. that was really trying to solve for what to do with this cash. And at the end of the day, what they decided to do is started a financial institution that was going to have cannabis as a niche, and be able to do the enhanced due diligence required. And so we worked hard, got one of the first charters in the state of Colorado in the last 10 years at the time. And the Fourth Corner Credit Union was born. And I worked every day to try to get the doors open. And the Federal Reserve actually was very open to the idea. We talked all the time about what the additional due diligence would look like, what we would need to do to comply with their rules and regulations. But where we kept hitting a snag was getting insurance for the funds. And so we spent the better part of 3 years, court battles and the like, to try to get the Fourth Corner open. And meanwhile, I would get call after call for financial institutions saying, hey, my state's considering doing this. Could you help me figure out my compliance? And so I started a compliance, Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering compliance company called DX Consulting, which I still have today. And DX basically said, oh, those who can't do, teach, right? So I started helping financial institutions across the nation figure out how to bank high-risk industries, including cannabis. And from there, it was a request from my clients. Hey, we've solved all these other issues, but now moving the cash has become challenging. The big three players that provide armored car services are not really interested in moving this money. Some of the Federal Reserves weren't interested in taking those funds. And so it was really a patchwork quilt of, some places would do it, some places wouldn't. An armored car would, be able to pick up in this area, but not another one. And so Empyreal Logistics was born. My business partner and I started it in 2018, and our operation started here in Denver, Colorado. And since that time, we are now in 45 states, and we work with over 300 financial institutions, and we count about 1.5 billion in cash every month. And cannabis is definitely a lion's share of that, but we actually work in all different mediums for cash-intensive businesses.
That's just incredible to me. Even like removing the cannabis piece of it, just the sheer thought of starting, all right, you know what we're going to do? There's a need. We see it on the horizon. Like, we're just going to start an armored vehicle cash transport company. Just the thought of that seems so overwhelming. The fact that you are able to make that leap and make it a reality is incredible. What actually, seriously, when you decided that's what you're going to do, what's the first thing you do? Do you just go out and buy an armored truck and get it outfitted and start driving around? Like, what is the first step in that journey?
No, I appreciate that. So in my banking days, that was one of our Achilles heel was the armored car paradigm, because what happens is you have these big steel cage trucks. They cost over 200 grand to build. Then they're so heavy that they're over 10,000 pounds. So you have to have a commercial driver's license to drive one. Then think about it. You go through maybe 20 jurisdictions during the course of a business day, and you have to be licensed to carry a firearm in all those jurisdictions. And if any of those things go wrong, you then have to punt the stop and say you're going to be there the next business day or whenever you can fit it into your route. So in my experience, our armored car showed up for our clients about 50% of the time. And that was the ceiling of what we had to try to break through when we started Empyreal. And so I looked at all those operational challenges, and I got a lot of people smarter than me in the room. And I said, how could we solve for some of these things? So first and foremost, those big vehicles that get 7 miles per gallon, could we retrofit commercial vans with a similar ballistics, with Kevlar, with a similar ballistic support, and then wrap a technology layer so that we can actually have real-time video surveillance and be proactive instead of reactive, so that we didn't have to always have the firearms present. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been held up in a robbery, but I have in my banking days. And I found that having a firearm present escalates the risk exponentially. The bad guys just bring bigger guns, and oftentimes it just creates more chaos if there's another firearm present. So if you follow what when the person fight or flight is asking you to do, and you're cool, calm, and collected, typically you can get out of there unscathed. And so I've had a lot of financial institutions not have that scenario happen, and unfortunately people get hurt. And so I wanted to try to figure out a solution that used AI technology and some of the latest technological advances to try to preempt that so that people could still be safe and we could track the cash in a different way if there was a robbery or burglary attempt. So yeah, with a lot of time and effort, it took a couple years to try to figure this, puzzle out. But thankfully, we were able to start Imperial, and we've had a lot of success since that time, and been able to tackle some of those challenges.
It's really interesting to me. The obviously the AI is fascinating to me, and how you went about imagining it and then developing it. But I think what I think our listeners might be wondering or thinking right now is, uh, if you think about let's zoom in on cannabis, right? The entire ecosystem around that industry that has emerged, and you talked about the early days in Colorado. These are things that, as former regulators, Erik and I, we anticipate some of, we need these different, we've got to grow the plant, get the plant to manufacturing, get the plant to retail, get it to testing, and then get it to a consumer. But in between each of those steps, there's logistics, there's transport, and then, like you said, there's this entire ecosystem around it of where's the cash going to go? And now the banks are saying, well, I don't want the cash, or I don't want to have duffel bags full of cash in my lobbies, those sorts of things. And to kind of zoom out now and appreciate all the different steps that you're solving for, but also proving concept on as well, I think is very fascinating to me. Because when you mentioned firearms, we were in Massachusetts, we explicitly prohibit the use of firearms in any transport vehicle. And the rationale is exactly as you talked about and discussed, which is that's going to escalate a situation or turn a bad situation worse. And we do want to guarantee, or at least do our best to ensure the safety of especially agents in those vehicles, but we don't want to put them in an escalated harm's way or with that risk. And also, there was obviously a concern from law enforcement about, we don't want shootouts in the streets and that sort of thing. And like you said too, one of the things I remember saying to our team at the time was it's just product, it's weed, it's not worth someone's life, it's not worth a bystander's life, that sort of thing. But I think just thinking about the ecosystem around cannabis and some of the problems that you've solved with it, but what you've also done is I think you've brought a very high degree of credibility to the allowance of banking, or the comfort of banks to come into this space to say, if I can partner with a company like Imperial and I can use and leverage those logistics, then now my feet are warmer as I step into this space. And I guess just thinking about that, as a new market emerges, how quickly are folks reaching out to you to say, can you help? Please help. And
Yeah.
what does that look like? What do those interactions look like? How do they find you? But then also, how do you sort of build that ecosystem around the cannabis space? Because I'll before I talk to you and others and kind of get as close as I am to the cannabis industry, I would not have even imagined the logistics that go into just the day-to-day functionality.
hmm Yeah, it is. A lot of things have to come together in concert to make it all work. But one thing the Federal Reserve was really clear with me on is that you cannot have product in your vehicle, right? So we made a clear delineation early on that we were not going to move product. I know some armored couriers will do that. We are staying on the other side of that argument with the Federal Reserve that we don't want to commingle product and cash. So we only move cash. And that was something that originally we would get some calls. Well, could you do both, right? Or could you do delivery? You're already out there, right? And so, we want to solve all the problems, but I think, we do best if we keep in our swim lane. So typically states will see us speak at a conference, or we'll hear through word of mouth. We're very close proximity to a lot of financial institutions and the regulators in those states. And, they know about our services. So typically our name comes up in conversation. And so we'll get a call pretty early on. Typically, the state is worried about how to move funds into, from fees or other proceeds that they're getting through taxation into their bank account. Some of their banks will allow cannabis funds, some will not. And so there's a whole discussion typically on how that will work and what the workflow looks like on the state side is typically where it starts. And then you'll start getting a trickle of financial institutions kicking the tires. Well, we're thinking about a program. We haven't decided yet. And so we put them in touch with experts that have software solutions and other experts in the space or the financial institutions. We typically act as a conduit for references at first. And then from there, we kind of lie in wait because the state has a lot of work to do, as you guys know, to get their regulatory environment created and to be able to license this industry in their state. So we're making contacts. We're, basically looking for spaces if it warrants it. But typically, I don't like to build a brick and mortar location in a new state yet, because we found it typically takes about a year and a half for the licensees, the state, everybody get their sea legs before there's enough cash to have the ROI to be able to fund a full branch. So you'll typically find us, we have a hub and spoke model where we'll have a vault location, we'll drive to other locations, so typically major urban centers, and then we'll work with the Federal Reserve locally to get those funds into the Federal Reserve. But until the ecosystem starts to mature, it's really hard to support a full branch in new states. But like, for instance, Minnesota, that's one of our most recent branches that we've added to our footprint. We did that one early because there was actually a lot of traditional business that was asking for our services. So that helped, so that when cannabis was ready, we were there with boots on the ground.
I have a two-part question here. For our listeners and maybe for me as well, when we're talking about when a state calls or when a financial institution calls and you're moving this cash, who are the clients of Empyreal? Is it the state? Is it the financial institutions themselves? Do you get brought on by operators that want their cash to be handled specifically by you guys? And the second part is delving into the brick and mortar piece. I find really interesting, the hub and spoke model, actual tangible footprint on the ground. When you go to retrieve, I realize now this is like, it should have been two separate questions. I apologize. But when you go to an operator and retrieve that money and you bring it back to headquarters, kind of where you quarterback your operations from, and when you say we need then to deliver it to the Federal Reserve, what does that actually look like?
Sure. So first and foremost, the financial institution is our client. So everybody has to be able to go through the enhanced due diligence to make sure that the money has been properly vetted and that it's coming from lawful sales. So once that relationship is established with the financial institution, then typically the financial institution would put us in touch with their clients, and we would work to coordinate pickups for those retail locations or cultivators or whomever needs the service.
So basically, is that like a stipulation? So I'm Erik's credit union. I'm going to have a cannabis division. I'm going to start taking like cannabis money, and offer those banking services. Is it a stipulation? So we're paying you to move the money, right? But we're also charging fees to our cannabis businesses. So it's just inherent in that relationship. Like if you were going to bank with Erik's credit union, you will be giving your cash to Empyreal Logistics.
Not necessarily. In the early days, most financial institutions had that model. But since the industry has evolved over the last 10, 15 years, we're seeing that some financial institutions will allow them to go to the branch. And so they don't always have to require armored services. But what people don't realize is that, every branch location has insurance, right? And insurance has threshold by which you can have enough cash on site. And cannabis typically tips those scales. So the financial institution, has maybe a full-time headcount of 5 people in a branch, 2 tellers, a branch manager, maybe a loan officer. And so when someone with cannabis comes in and they have, $1 million in deposit, that puts everybody at that branch at risk. So some folks have then pivoted to say, okay, we'll have an armored car come pick it up at that location. We'll take it back to our secured facility. We'll validate that cash. So we'll count it with our currency counters that are tied to updated firmware with the Federal Reserve so we can detect counterfeit or unfit notes. And then from there, we will take it to the Federal Reserve to deposit into the financial institution's master account with the Federal Reserve, and then send them a settlement sheet so that the financial institution can credit their respective clients. In the case with the Federal Reserve, though, I don't think a lot of people realize you just can't roll up to the Federal Reserve. Like, this is
Yeah,
not something where
that's
you
what
can
led
just
to
be
my
like, "Well,
question. Hey,
yeah,
Fed.
I'm here." So you do have to
In my
go through a
armored car.
process of, right, of approval. You have to be vetted, and many of the states that we work with, including Massachusetts, which has one of the most robust, security checks in the industry, we have to be vetted. Every state and jurisdiction that we operate. So
Did you hear
it's
that,
a
Erik?
pretty.
Massachusetts, most robust. Did you hear that?
I know you have a
We'll
specific
write it down.
license for armored car.
Yeah, robust does not equal best in any way, shape, or form.
I heard what I heard.
So yeah, you get the idea. It's not something that is easily accomplished by someone just wanting to get cash into the banking system. So from there, I think the financial institutions have said, okay, well, if they can't go into our branches because that's creating a bottleneck, it takes a long time to count that much cash. A lot of them have pivoted to their night depositories. The hard part is that most people don't have a lot of cash. So if you go to a night drop at a bank, it's like a little slip of paper that you can, put an envelope into, but it doesn't have a right. It doesn't have a big capacity for a duffel bag of cash. So yeah. So everybody has to deal with these just kind of fundamental issues before they start their program. And we try to help them with those decisions. And if they say, hey, we do want to have the flexibility to have them come to the branch, but we don't have the capacity to count it, then we'll go to the branch every day and go collect those deposits, count them on their behalf. But they have to have a place to store it. So they have to have enough vault storage. They have to have the capacity to be able to check all those deposits in. And so the industry, I don't think, realizes the complexity of all that's happening in the background. So they just see the fees, which is unfortunate. That I mean, I wish you could be more transparent with how expensive this all is, but the financial institution typically has to buy software to be able to, because their standard compliance software doesn't have all the bells and whistles it needs to track cannabis sales. Then they have headcount increase. Then they have to file SARs and CTRs, which suspicious activity reports and currency transaction reports. And those are very time consuming. They have to do that on all the transactions that occur. The SARs obviously have a different cadence. It's within the first 30 days for a new relationship, and then 90 days thereafter for all the cannabis funds. And for the CTRs, it's anything over $10,000 in one transaction or an aggregate. So they have to have software to be able to help them with this heavy lift and train people. And then on top of it, they're hiring me, right, to try to help with that effort and count and be able to move the cash for them. And so all of this has created a scenario where the financial institutions unfortunately don't have an examination guideline. That's one of the things that's missing from all this cannabis legislation that's flying around. There was one bill that talked about the FFIEC giving some examination guidelines, but for now, every financial institution has an interpretation of what they're supposed to do. The guidance that was given is, from 2013, 2014, so it hasn't matured as the industry's matured. And then meanwhile, we have regulators. If you're a state-regulated financial institution or a federally regulated financial institution, all those regulators have a different interpretation of what you're supposed to do. So in every other product that you have in banking, it's going to be maybe a 1 or 2% differential, like a rate change or how they treat you for the type of products or services. In cannabis, it is wildly different. And so I typically find that a lot of the cannabis folks will shop. And, unfortunately, the financial institutions are up against pricing, customer service, footprint. If they had to do a heavy lift on compliance, for software, their fees might be higher than someone down the street that's been in it for a few years, right? And so I think the industry is really not aware of all that's happening behind the scenes that, unfortunately makes this more expensive. I think they just see the invoice and like, one other bill that I have to deal with in cannabis, right? Pick in my pocket.
And that's a great point that especially that last, I want to maybe hone in on that a little bit, which is the industry, the cannabis industry proper, I think just sees all these different pressure points. They pay more in rent. They pay more for legal fees. They pay more for accounting fees. But then, of course, comes the banking, and they're just like, these fees are killing me. But I think you just walked us through a bit of why those fees are what they are, and the human cost that goes into that from the monitoring, et cetera. And obviously the software can help supplement that, but that's not free. And to your point too, the more you can scale that across a good deal of customers, the more you can spread that cost out. But you also don't, as a financial institution, don't want to be over concentrated in a particular area, which obviously leads to some additional risk for you as an institution. But every guidance document I've seen, or every sort of update I've seen from any regulator or examiner, it usually starts with this is not legal. Don't do it. But if you had to do it, or if you wanted to do it, follow these rules. But again, it's don't do it. But and then sort of like a wink, and then. But I think do you see? You mentioned earlier the financial institutions that will call you and say we're thinking about doing this. Do you have a sense of, is it those that call you, is it like a scared straight opportunity where you're like, welcome, let me give you my spiel, and they're like, thank you for your time, we'll see you never? Or is it more of a, okay, like, could you pin a percentage to 20% actually go into the space? Or, and then also I'd wonder how many get in and go, yeah, not for us. Because you mentioned those CTRs, the SARS reports, I know in Massachusetts, one of the things we did early on was actually allow access into Metric just for monitoring. And so it was those sorts of things of being able to know your customer and have all those challenges. But it's a very hands-on, a bank or a financial institution saying yes to cannabis is a commitment. And now, to your point too, customers are beginning to shop, and I'm wondering what that churn even looks like. Of, I can save $500 a month by switching to this financial institution because they're going to open a cannabis division. Erik's credit union all of a sudden wants to dip their toe in, maybe bit off more than they can chew, and now they're going back to that old financial institution to say, please take me back. I miss you. So I guess there's a lot of, back to maybe Erik's error earlier, as far as maybe should have asked one question versus two questions. But do you have a sense of, as you talk to these financial institutions that are curious, how many of them are actually serious? And then those that do get in, do they stay in, or does it sort of trickle out after, like, does it level set eventually?
Sure. Yeah, no, all good questions. And
Do you
the
hear that,
funniest
Erik?
thing is
All good questions.
Oh my
Oh,
gosh, here we
good.
go.
It's going to be
Come
unbearable
on, Erik,
today.
up your game, please.
Yeah.
Give me some harder questions. So every state is different. Massachusetts actually has probably one of the most per capita that we've seen that were willing to take the risk and jump into the cannabis space. Most of the financial institutions we had conversations with were already underway with their programs. Minnesota is another one that has a lot of folks interested. My home state, Colorado, less than 10. And it's still that way after all these years. So, I think the regulatory environment is such now that I think most regulators accept that this might be part of a portfolio. So I don't really see a lot of that regulatory pushback. What I see is, if you already have a very competitive market for banking, and then you add this as an extra wrinkle, some financial institutions look at this as a way to try to differentiate, whereas others are like, no, I have my hands full already. This is so expensive. I really don't have the bandwidth to take this on. So I think where we kind of enter the equation, most financial institutions are interested. And thankfully, because I have the compliance side, I can kind of start them down the path. Like, have you done a business plan? Have you done a stress test on your fee structure? Because if you have 100 accounts, yeah, that probably pays for itself. But what if it trickles in and you only have 10 in the first year? Are you willing to have a loss leader that your board is going to look at as a drain on resources? And what's your end goal? If your goal is non-interest income, which is the fees that financial institutions receive, those days are over. That used to be that case, 10 years ago, maybe even 5 in some states. But now it's really mining those relationships for further depth in the future. Like, could they do commercial loans after this becomes legal or rescheduled? Could they be strong commercial partners? Is there an opportunity to bank their employees? Yeah, so there's lots of things that the financial institution has to determine that they're going to be comfortable with as far as the risk portfolio before they move forward. I think the other thing we always try to be mindful of is that if the business is a lot of these businesses don't love to pay the fee. But here's the thing. I always like to structure or advise a financial institution. If you have like a large MSO and they have 30 stores over a multi-state footprint, try to give one account per store. And here's why, because you don't know if one store is going to have a bad actor. And that bad actor could taint the rest of those deposits. If you're trying to monitor all, obviously it has to have the same EIN, but if it has the same, EIN and then the money comes through and one bad actor, then the whole account gets shut down and everything falls apart. But if you could just cut off think of a big evergreen tree, if you could just cut off that limb and the rest of the financial transactions can be validated, I think that's an important thing that a lot of the industry misses, is that you might be paying more per account, but you're giving yourself safety in the future in case you have a bad actor. Sadly, the industry is really blind to how many folks will come. I mean, maybe that's not accurate. They might know that there's like a 20% of their folks aren't always going to be on the up and up, but unfortunately, I think that they're short-sighted when it comes to the money behind the compliance and what they're paying for.
So you said a couple of things that leads to my next question. And hopefully it's a good one. I feel like I have pressure on me right now.
Pressure's on, yeah.
But we said, all right, we have operators in the space that now have the convenience or the luxury or whatever you want to call it to be able to shop for banking. More banks are in there. You mentioned that your federal and state banking regulators now, if they see this as work that a financial institution does, they're not surprised that it's part of their portfolio. So in the 10-year, the decade plus since Colorado was the first to come online, and you had that working group and we started working through these things, have we solved cannabis banking?
Yeah, very good question. That is a good question.
It's a deep question, Shawn.
That's how you got to that question?
Yeah. The things that were said leaving me to believe that maybe we have solved for it. And all of the chatter in DC is maybe it would be nice, but it's not needed. I don't know. Have we solved cannabis banking? I feel like.
Yeah. I think that you have to ask us, each audience will have a different answer. If you ask the cannabis operators, they will say no. And I agree with them, because right now the services are limited. Some financial institutions offer a full breadth of services: checking, savings, money market, treasury solutions, loans, but not all of them. And so they're put into these small boxes of maybe just a checking account. They don't earn interest on their funds. They don't have a way to be able to have access to cheap capital, right? So they go to hard money lenders, or they go to the financial institution, and the financial institution has a ton of covenants in place, and it's a pretty expensive deal. They don't have a way to declare bankruptcy or do a restructuring in most of the loans that are out there. So it's a challenge for them, and the fees are onerous, right? And I think where I worry about the industry, though, is money service businesses like a Paychex Place or a Western Union and the like. It has a high propensity for money laundering, right? And I don't think that the cannabis industry has accepted. They literally have a disappearing product, right? You have a curing time where it was, the flower was at the top of the jar, and then it, lost its water weight, and now the dry weight is different, and every business is more efficient, or how they're processing that is different. And so the financial institution is really going to have to prove out that this business is not money laundering. And that's almost impossible to do without all the technology and all of the things that they are equipping themselves with for the enhanced due diligence. So after we get through this regulatory, whatever it's going to be, we'll have to talk about that later, this change, I still feel like there's going to be enhanced due diligence required, because it'll have a high propensity for bad actors to come in and exploit the system. Right? So do I think there'd be more opportunities for additional products? Absolutely. But do I feel that there's still going to be a heavy lift financially for the FI to be compliant and to validate these transactions? I do. Will some things be cheaper? Well, credit card, they're going to charge them a premium, because they do for all of those kind of high risk industries, right? So is it cheaper than cash? I think you can argue two ways on that. But on the banking side, I would say bankers would say, yes, we have enough competitive folks in the space that we're having to really fine tune our programs to be able to offer something in the market that's competitive. But can we do everything today? No. Are we still a little nervous and our board's freaking out because we're not making as much money as we should to cover the big expense? Yeah, I think you're seeing a lot of programs start to realize we're going to shut this down because it's been a loss leader for too long. And so the folks that have been in for a long time, they are staying and they're getting bigger and bigger, the financial institutions. And the smaller mom and pop players, the regional financial institutions, we're seeing a lot of those shut their programs down.
Those programs shutting down, I think about one of the reasons that I think part of cannabis banking is also very technical, challenging, or it labor intensive is risk and managing risk, and that's across the board, right? That you're dealing with a lion's share of that from a physical harm and sort of a tracking standpoint as well as compliance. But these are also risky clients. It's a volatile industry. The margins are exceptionally tight. Like you said, the lenders are they're aggressive, and we're seeing a lot of receiverships, and that restructuring opportunity, like you said, doesn't really present itself. But as a result, I wonder, you can sort of do the behind the scenes nuts and bolts of banking, but then comes in the human aspect of managing the client and assessing the client and who is the client in some instances. And then you start getting letters from lenders or, and people wanting to assume the account and that sort of thing, where that risk, I think, is a bit more delicate and also novel. I mean, it's not, there's always going to be circumstances in banking, especially where, litigation comes into play and you've got to hold assets and that sort of thing. But I wonder, in your experience or what you've seen, especially lately, is it seems to me, at least on the sort of anecdotal side, that's picking up a lot. And also some of these questions are in fact novel of, we're seeing tax compliance issues across the board, and money capital is definitely expensive to acquire. And so I think some of that is basically, I'll owe it to the state tomorrow when they come and get it, but for now I need to float my next location, or I need to float next month's payroll, whatever it might be. But that aspect, I wonder, and obviously this is something I wonder if you do deal with it through Empyreal, but also just with your financial institution partners, is that becoming sort of a stress point, or where a bank might say, this is too much. That management, that oversight, that overhead is just, it's too labor intensive. And it's also, like you said, I can imagine a bank board sitting around and going like, this isn't worth the squeeze. This is not, we'd rather get into mortgages and commercial loans and that sort of thing. Like, no thanks. When cannabis is legal, we'll reconsider it. But that volatility, I'm wondering if that's become a stress point that maybe turns people off.
Yeah, that's a great segue into something that is challenging in banking in general. As a banker that has been in the industry now almost 30 years, I think banking is going away. I mean, we're seeing digital charters, we're seeing, people not going to branches, we're seeing Apple, doing their own accounts. Like, your traditional bank structure is under siege, right? So then you add the wrinkle of cannabis compliance and money service businesses and cryptocurrency, and the folks that are doing it, they probably need to be in all of those high risk buckets to be able to get the ROI that they need, right? So that the juice is worth the squeeze. But then regulatorily, if you look at somebody that has all those risk buckets, you're like, how are you managing that? You're going to have the regulators in your shop more often, right? You have to have an A+ team to be able to do all those things. And the nuances you mentioned, like receiverships and cannabis banking consultants, give me headaches, right? Because they're trying to assume accounts, and like, there's so many creative ways the industry is trying to solve some of their problems, but it also creates such a problem on the banking side. I don't think that they realize that they're kind of their own worst enemy in some cases. So yeah, financial institutions have to have a lot of wherewithal to stick in it and have their boards of directors feel comfortable having a loss leader. And then at some point, they have to decide, okay, if, cannabis might not be making that much money, what are the other risk buckets we're willing to tolerate, and at what level Are we willing to have a concentration risk in those different buckets so that, the rest of our portfolio can thrive and yet our financial institution can still be healthy when we have all the onslaught of these digital charters and other things happening that's kind of rendering the traditional banking system almost archaic.
Do you the other from a risk standpoint or sort of a compliance standpoint, are there like industries to cannabis? Are there other examples that, like, if I build out a cannabis compliance division within my financial institution, are there other sectors I should be therefore looking at, or that I could pivot to with some minor modifications, not wholesale revamp? Or what are those other industries? What do they look like?
Yeah, I think it was Operation Choke Point that kind of identified all of them back in the day. It was like strip clubs, MSBs, pawn shops, anything that you can imagine that
Come
has
on down to Erik's Credit Union. We'll take everybody.
exactly. Yeah, so anything that's high risk, crypto obviously is another bucket that would be high risk. But again, I think the financial institution has to decide what level of risk they're comfortable with, right? Because all of those different tentacles, if you will, of risk are can be a little scary, right? There's a lot of stuff to learn, and you can't go in there um, being naive because you will get yourself and your BSA officer in trouble. Yeah, I think reputation risk is something that everybody looks at. I know that recently under this administration, the reputation risk that used to be more heavily weighted on examinations is kind of moved off of the high risk radar. But that said, I think that financial institutions, I mean, cannabis has been around for a while now. I mean, Colorado had a medical program well long before we had adult use. And so now it's just part of the fabric of our economy. We don't I would be hard pressed. I mean, I do think some people feel like it led Colorado down to a bad path with some homelessness and other issues that we're experiencing here. And some states can kind of, I think you can point the finger at lots of different things when there's problems within your state, right? Is it cannabis? Is it other things? Is it socioeconomic pressures? Who knows, right? It might be all of those things. But I don't really see reputation risk as the biggest risk for cannabis. I see some of those other industries that you mentioned to try to get the ROI. Boards of directors are a little more skittish.
So I want to transition a little bit and talk about some of your lived experiences running Empyreal Logistics. And we've talked a lot about all of the things that all of these operators and vendors and financial institutions do in the cannabis ecosystem in order to maintain compliance and do the best job possible to not make waves in order to be able to basically do their business and go home at night. However, I know we still operate in this gray space, and Empyreal Logistics has been in some, I don't know what you would call them, sticky situations before. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it, but interesting scenarios have unfolded in your day-to-day operations. And I'm thinking specifically of the fairly high-profile case in Kansas, and I hope we can talk about this because I find it fascinating and incredibly interesting, where just doing your work, an Empyreal truck was stopped. I think it was taken possession of by the feds. They had your cash. And then when you find yourself in that scenario, first of all, it must be fairly intense as being the president and CEO of a company and having that happen to you. What happens then? Can you give our listeners just a little bit of the background of that story? Because like I said, I find it fascinating.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, in the state of Kansas, cannabis was not legal, but in their neighboring state of Missouri, it was and is. And as you guys might know, the topography, so Kansas City basically straddles both sides. One part of it's on the Kansas side, one part it's on the Missouri side. And so we were picking up from the Missouri side. And, it was early days. So we didn't realize that, like with gambling proceeds and other things that might not be legal in another state, they don't typically disturb or take seizure of those funds, right? And so we had the same thought process is, okay, we'll drive through Kansas back to our vault in Colorado and we'll process these funds. And the sheriff's department had other ideas on that. And so why we were dealing with that issue, the money's been vetted, the operators were all properly licensed. There was nothing that didn't check the box for the FinCEN guidance. We thought we were all in 100% compliance. But where that states' rights, friction came in to play is something we hadn't considered before. And obviously, we a lot of lessons learned since then. But I think more interesting than the Kansas case, because, I think the state of Kansas asserted its right. Ultimately, we got the money back, but it wasn't until after we were seized in California. Now, California, it has been legal there for a very long time. And unfortunately, the state was battling, a dark market for, game of whack-a-mole, unfortunately. And one of the stops that we were on, again, the financial institutions do their due diligence. The regulators are in there checking these businesses. But there was some intel that we were not privy to that some of these places were being watched. And so when the sheriff's department decided to seize those funds, it was a shock to all of us, right? Because we're like, well, wait, this is a state that's been, cutting edge of cannabis regulatory reform and trying to make things happen. And so when the funds were seized, not once but twice, we were all scratching our heads because this was not supposed to happen. We all had an agreement, essentially, is what, a gentleman's agreement, but an agreement nonetheless. And so what I found over that 2-year battle to get those funds back is there is an inherent misunderstanding of the banking system in the United States. And also what armored car companies are allowed to do and to know. So that's where the requirement for the financial institution becomes paramount in this conversation, because the financial institution is privy to information, confidential information, sales information, ownership, things that we are not always privy to. So what we do as Empyreal is they have a financial institution. The financial institution is regulated. Their regulators are checking their program. So we trust that everybody's doing their jobs properly. The enhanced due diligence is being enacted. So we'll get, Secretary of State, we'll get their license, we'll get their beneficial owners, we'll get the information that we need. But the financial institution at the end of the day has to bless that relationship and say, yes, they are compliant. Empyreal, go pick up on our behalf. Because the money is never Empyreal's money. We are always acting as a courier. The legal term is a bailee for these funds. And so at the end of the day, they're the financial institution's funds, and the business is allowing the financial institution to use us as an agent, right? And so we went back to some of the financial institutions and the businesses, and we're like, hey, help prove that this money is legit. We have blinders on as far as your daily transactions. Let's just show law enforcement that you guys are all compliant. And I'm sure that they, at the end of the day, were compliant. But nobody wanted to show people their programs, right? Like outside of their regulator, they didn't want the additional scrutiny. And so we had made everybody whole. Empyreal did at the time, out of our working capital. And it was another lesson learned, because then nobody really wants to help if they got their money back, right? So, we were above suspicion. We were basically just picking up. But because we were holding the money, we were like, oh, well, this probably will hit our insurance and it'll be fine. We'll figure it out. Well, no, seizure is not covered by insurance. And as somebody who was a trailblazer in this space, it was a hard lesson learned. okay, so now we have this big debt. We're trying to figure out how to like get people to cooperate with us to clear our name because we had, no insight into the other sides. And the thing that people don't realize about banking is it's by design, right? You don't want the armored car company. You don't want the client to know all the information that you're reporting on, right? Because if they are doing something suspicious and you're providing that to a federal agent so that they can do investigative work on what's happening, they want the blinders on. They want you to stay in the swim lane because they're not going to tell me they're filing a suspicious activity report on someone I'm picking up, right? Because I might blow the whole investigation. And so what ended up really tipping the scales for us is we asked if I could have a conversation. It wasn't an interrogation, but have a conversation with the people that seized the funds so I could explain all of these things to them. And there was so many misconceptions. Oh, you guys are actually doing the enhanced due diligence. You guys are actually filing the SARs and CTRs. Well, some armored car companies have that licensure that they act almost financial institution like, but we purposely hadn't done that because we wanted our financial institutions to have that swim lane themselves. So yeah, after that very long 4+ hour conversation, we were able to get those funds back. And
Just a big misunderstanding. It's
it was really
just a
at the end
paperwork
of the
issue.
day.
Who do we make the check out to?
It's
Yeah.
so good to hear that though on the human level. It's just like I reached out, I asked to have a conversation, let's talk this out, and there was actually a positive outcome. Well, Deirdre made it seem pretty simple. In my brain, it makes me happy to keep it that. So my question is, who are you having the conversation with in that scenario?
So they were federal law enforcement officers. So typically how a seizure works is there's going to be a local agency that seizes the funds, and then they need to have a federal agency. So it could be Homeland Security, it could be the FBI, it could be the DEA, has to partner on that. And they basically do, I hate to say it in these terms, but almost like a rev share of whatever their seizure is. And so, yeah, we weren't clear at first who the federal agency was, but it ended up being the FBI in one case and the DEA in another. And, thankfully, again, cooler heads prevailed. We were able to prove out our innocence. The financial institutions at the end of the day did help. The business is not so much, but that's okay. We understand that there's an uphill battle there. But we definitely changed how we did business after that and had to get really clear with insurance and what the lanes were on what was a criminal event versus what's a seizure, and educated a lot of people in the process, including myself, right? I didn't know all the nuances for seizure.
When cash is seizure, lesson learned, do not make people whole until there's a resolution. Yeah.
Escrow. Everything goes into escrow.
Yeah. Guess who's helping get this money back? You guys.
You cannot transport that product across state lines. So if it's easier to get there by going through Rhode Island, don't go through Rhode Island. And the reason we do it is because we can't authorize you or bless you to go into Rhode Island with what is a controlled substance, but also it's to manage or mitigate your own risk. And then obviously if you violate those rules and something happens, we're clean. We told you not to. But the same is true for states that, and I'll just, again, I think stay in Massachusetts for a moment. That's why the complications of things like Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, or places like, Puget Sound and others where now we're looking at federal waters or federal airspace and those sorts of things. We get accused often as regulators of overcomplicating it, but I think your human example is why some of those complications may exist. And I think it also speaks to the work that banks or financial institutions will do to know their customer and monitor those accounts and look for suspicious activities. Why the feds want those. I've always said it. If the feds wanted to sort of fix the banking issue, they have all the information they would need to see that money moving in and out based on all the reports that get filed to them. They don't have to kick a door in to move on the cannabis industry. They could just freeze a couple accounts, and that would send a massive ripple effect throughout the entire industry. But I think it just, regulators especially, sort of being sympathetic, get accused of overcomplicating things. But I think, again, I'll just reiterate that what you just described is the reason for some of those complications. Not saying it's, is it ideal? Of course not. But that's why, as state regulators, we're living within a federal confine. And like I said, I can't authorize someone to go into Rhode Island to make that delivery, even though it's a 5-minute drive. The 30-minute drive is the compliant one. So sorry.
Well, and you bring up an excellent point in that we thought we were being compliant because we go through licensure. We go through, I'm a security agent in most states that we operate. If not having, if the state requires having a local person, then the resident will be the agent on behalf of Empyreal. But we go through that process, right? So we're very transparent. At the time it was, 4 or 5 years ago, we were heavily concentrated in cannabis. Well, now the majority of our business is actually non-cannabis. And, the question I get most often is, well, you were seized. And so are my funds going to be seized now as restaurant or fast food place, right? And the nice thing is that with those lessons learned, we now have packets of information that we give to law enforcement. We have the legal team that now understands the questions of law and understands seizure. I feel like actually we're probably better equipped than even the big 3 players to handle any of these issues going forward, because we now understand the complicated regulatory environment for those types of things that happen. And they can happen anywhere, at any time for any business, right? You can money launder, unfortunately, through any cash intensive business. So I think the opposite is true, is that we thought we were going above and beyond to be compliant, be transparent. And I think in some ways, it was a challenge because there was just a misconception from law enforcement. And the other thing I think is you have to combat is there are high density drug trafficking areas all across the US, right? And our law enforcement officers have a huge lift trying to keep communities safe. And so they see money rolling through, or they see, these cannabis businesses with cash and having their employees move product, and they don't know what they don't know, right? They're going to pull over folks and they're going to try to do their due diligence. In places where cannabis is legal, there's lots of places where you still have bad actors. And so I think the best thing you can do is cooperate and try to give as much information as possible and try not to disrupt the process so they do their research, right? Or they do their investigation.
So we're coming up on an hour here, and certainly want to touch upon the future of cannabis and banking and the work that Empyreal is doing before we let you go. So as I mentioned in my fancy speech at the very top, there's been some recent news around the Trump administration maybe moving cannabis to Schedule 3 as early as Monday, which may be the day we're actually releasing this podcast. Shawn, I don't know. You tell me. And then obviously we have safe banking, which it seems like it comes back every year. It's Lucy, Charlie Brown, and the football, it seems like. But I would imagine there would be a different conversation, or maybe a different outcome in a post-Schedule 3 world around the conversation in DC around banking. So that's just a long way of saying this is kind of a fun game and not necessarily Empyreal specific, but what's your best guess? What's your estimate? Where do we see, I don't know, cannabis banking? And I guess we can tie it back to the work that you're doing. I would say in 5 years, but with this recent news, I would say this time next year, or within the next 2 years. Do you have a crystal ball, a prediction of what the new normal may look like, how it may impact the work that you're doing, and maybe even the work that Shawn and I do with states?
Yeah. I'm nervous, guys. I'm very nervous for rescheduling. Not necessarily for Imperial's sake, but for the sake of the cannabis operators. I think everybody telegraphs the relief that they're going to feel about 280E, right? Okay, well then, um, yeah, that happens. But then if there's a federal agency that needs to set up a regulatory regime, how are they going to pay for that? The pound of flesh is still going to come from the industry, I believe, right? And so is the offset for 280E going to be excise tax on all these transactions so that we can get a federal regulator in place? And then what happens with states and their regulatory regimes? Because they're already getting the excise tax. Like there's only so much of the pie to go around, right? And the states have become really reliant. I mean, state of California has over 7.8 billion in tax revenue that they've published when it comes to cannabis. Yeah, if I were the federal government, I'd probably want to get my share of taxes too. And so I'm just very nervous for the industry and how that's going to play out with their, working capital and at the end of the day, their individual pocketbooks. Now, do I think that's going to open the door for some additional investment, some additional banking opportunities? Absolutely. But at what cost, right? Are we going to have a paradigm where there's a medical, that's a very clear path for medical, but then what happens with adult use? Is adult use going to be regulated by the states? Is there going to be a federal regulator? I don't know, guys. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I feel like there's more questions than answers at this point.
I mean, I think unfortunately that tends to be, well, I'm trying not to be too political about this, but I highly doubt those questions have been asked and answered inside of the Oval Office before a signing ceremony. I think what happens is a directive to agencies to figure it out, and then that's where the chaos begins, unfortunately. I think the questions you're asking are very astute as to how the fault lines tend to break, which is like we said earlier, it doesn't address adult use recreational. It might enhance medical. It could free up research. You mentioned the capital markets, all those things, but they're all what ifs. And I think they're also not imminent. I think there's going to be a very unsettling, uncomfortable phase. But the one point that you made that it's something I've been mentioning to folks I talk to a lot around, well, why wouldn't the feds legalize? And my answer is 280E. They're reaping a windfall from these businesses, and removing it from Schedule 1 removes that windfall in most instances for them, such that they have to fill that gap somehow. They're living high off those revenues. And why would they give that up? And because they're never going to implement an effective tax rate of 90%, but they're effectively doing that now. So why? And I hate to be kind of the Debbie Downer about that, or sort of the realistic, I guess it is negative, but it's more, I guess I'm just very pessimistic that rescheduling goes smoothly, for one. And then second would be that there's not some, at least, consideration of where are we going to get that money from? And is it going to be, I think to your point, is it going to cascade to the feds and then to the states? Are the states going to still collect theirs? And then obviously you've got this, what happens with hemp and the future of that. Like that's all of this stuff is sort of swirling where loopholes get closed, rescheduling happens. Curaleaf is pulling out of hemp altogether, but apparently the administration talked to cannabis executives when they were considering this. And I wonder, I'm not a conspiracy theorist by nature, at least I don't think I am. I am on a podcast, so maybe I am, but I just wonder to myself, I think I'm definitely echoing your sentiment, which is I don't think it gets easier. I don't think we get a lot of clarity. I also wonder if some of that is by design too, of let's see which agencies do get involved. Let's see how also agencies, especially the federal government, do not move quickly or sometimes in a straight line. So I think there's a lot that needs to transpire. I think there's going to be a lot more confusion before there's answers. I do have a question on safe banking, but I want to get Erik's take on rescheduling first, and see if he has anything to illuminate us with.
I mean, I think most of what you're saying is right. It just seems like it's the natural order of things, right? We've talked about this on the podcast before. Like this is still a new industry, like a frontier of sorts. And the fact that everything is messy and will remain messy for the foreseeable future seems right. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to come to a place where there is some semblance of order and structure. I'm confident we'll get there, but I'm also pessimistic on the timeline and how bumpy that road will be. I mean, I think the Schedule 3 thing is a good thing for all the reasons that we brought up, right? Like the 280E, I think is a real thing. You hear that all the time. I think from like a regulator's perspective or public health advocates and stakeholders, like the additional research that's going to be able to be done is certainly a great thing. There are the other ancillary benefits, but the one thing that I do question about this move is like, at the end of the day, there's the differentiation of the medical product itself and what those pathways are going to look like at the federal level, but the adult use at the state level is still going to be in the same exact position that it is now. So how much actually changes outside of those things that we brought up, and who's going to take advantage of whatever those future federal regulatory pathways look like? I just have the fear that it's going to be the big pharma, the big groups that are able to capitalize in this new reality. And it's just going to be status quo. That is also coupled with getting rid of 280E I could see there not being a lot of change. I could see there being a lot of change. How bumpy is it to we get to the point down the road where there's a little bit of structure in these things?
I remember I was on a panel a couple of years ago. It was in Massachusetts. It was a local thing, and I was asked a question about rescheduling and what I thought would happen and how it would be such a great thing for the industry was sort of the premise of the question. And I remember saying, here in Massachusetts, we care deeply about social equity, and I'm not familiar with any mom and pop drug companies. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know about your corner pharmaceutical manufacturer.
Yeah.
That is local, right? Like I worry about, we're all looking for, and I kind of hate to be pessimistic about it, but I think the reality is that this business gets bigger before it gets smaller. And I think that bigger evolution brings consolidation and it brings a concentration. And I think at some point your supply chain probably gets consolidated into much larger entities. And then it's going to become a game of survival around which brands survive, sort of which brands within a supply chain, whether it's the manufacturing brands or the retail chains and that sort of thing. But my fear is that consolidation. My hope is that consolidation means people are getting bought and acquired and their IP is being respected. But you look at now with like things like genetics, we're only just starting to give people credit for genetics and letting them actually earn off of that work that they did way back when. And so I just think that settling aspect, if not done carefully, has the risk of letting a lot of people down that have invested a ton into this sort of gold rush, right? Like I think, Erik, the pioneer aspect of it is definitely appropriate. But I just, again, I'm not familiar with the small business pharmaceutical company, and because it's just not it's not a thing. So I think cannabis is definitely going to build a domestic supply chain. And then the last point I'll make on the supply chain is it also brings in not just interstate commerce, but import export. And Canada is doing, from a genetic standpoint, from a quality standpoint, from a GMP standpoint, they are ripe to introduce to our markets. And so that California weed still may not be making its way to Massachusetts. There's a good chance it might be coming from up north. So, because why should they continue shipping it to Germany if they don't have to? So just, I think a lot there to unpack. But on the safe banking piece in particular, especially with your niche, and I realize Erik's probably going to just make me stop recording at some point, but what gets easier with safe banking? But I wonder, does it also make some aspects harder potentially? Like it's a permission, it's an allowance, but I wonder, it just changes compliance. It doesn't remove compliance. And so I guess my curiosity from your standpoint is, does it make life easier for a company like Empyreal, for your partners on the financial side, or does it just change the complexity, or now we're just doing a different form of the same compliance?
Yeah, I mean, I think safe banking was relevant, maybe at early stages of this process, but it hasn't evolved. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's been changes to the bill, but I think it needs to address matters of insurance. We've had a lot of exploitation on the insurance side. Financial services encompasses a lot. It's not just banking, right? And I think there needs to be a lot of clarity on just all the aspects as it relates to financial services. And safe banking was trying to do that in some way, even in it's a small way. But the only thing that I was really excited about is it had examination guidelines that they were mandating. That's something we absolutely need to have consistency across the board, because I see it really being haphazardly applied. Some financial institutions are expected to do huge effort, where other financial institutions, I think, are just complying with the FinCEN, but not going above and beyond that. And it really is creating a tough competitive landscape. But, at the end of the day, my hope is that this is the final kind of push, that it's going to be so chaotic with rescheduling that it will move Congress to finally just say, all right, Uncle, we will go ahead and and deschedule completely and do this right.
Amen.
It's doing something. My goodness.
Yeah.
What a novel idea that is. But I mean, you think about all the things that are colliding in DC right now. I mentioned hemp. You've got the Supreme Court cases. You've got, but the president might reschedule. There's enough of a collision that I wonder, is there like a big bang moment of some point where it's like, all right, we are at like system overload, or does everyone just do the thing where it's like, that's a Supreme Court problem, that's a congressional problem, I just think the irony of Congress during the shutdown saying, yeah, this intoxicating hemp, it's dangerous for kids, we've got to get it off the streets, we've got to get it out of gas stations. And then it's like, sure, I'll sign that bill. By the way, here's another executive order that says, let's legalize at least medical. It's like the left hand doesn't know the right hand, never mind what it's doing. They're so upset with each other, they're not talking to each other. And then I think anything to really get done in Congress needs some bipartisan approach. And I just wonder if we're careening too fast toward midterms that's just not possible. So again, I'm really living up to that pessimistic reputation, but yeah, a lot of moving pieces. But Erik, what part of your agenda did we not get to?
We didn't get to trivia, which is totally fine, because the trivia question that I have, per usual, is terrible. So I say we just skip it, and then, well, when we're done recording, I can share it with you. I'll tell you why I have issue with the trivia question. Anyway, I think that's a good point. We've been going for quite a while here, Deirdra. I think I certainly speak for Shawn and obviously myself and our listeners, and thank you for coming on and having this conversation with us. It's just such an interesting part of the cannabis ecosystem. And I know a lot of our former colleagues and friends still listen. And as I said at the beginning, this seems like a spot in the ecosystem that there is I don't want to say misunderstanding, but there's a lack of knowledge around the complexity of the work that you're doing and helping making the whole system work. So the fact that you were able to give us some time of your day to come on and share your lived experience and the work that you're doing, just thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure.
So thank you, Deirdra, especially, the complexity of what you're doing. But I think for our listeners, the amount of behind the scenes work that goes on just to make this industry function responsibly. It takes leaders like Deirdra and her company and the people that she works with and alongside throughout the entire financial institution and that whole ecosystem, the ingenuity, the creativity you've developed. But just thank you for bringing it and sharing it with us. But also as former regulators, it's sort of a compliment, which is to know that the work you do is often taken for granted. It happens, it functions, it is behind the scenes, but it is so integral to just, again, the functionality of a viable marketplace. So, and back to sort of the hybrid podcast aspect of this, you're exactly the type of guest we wanted to bring to our listeners, which is, you may not know that this is even happening, and we want to bring awareness to that. But again, I would just encourage our listeners to, if you have questions, or if you're a financial institution that's thinking about this, or you're just if you don't have any sense of what's going on behind the scenes, there are people like Deirdra out there that are doing this work, that are experts at this effort. And we're grateful to have you today, and certainly hope to have you back on as this thing evolves in DC or elsewhere. But we also hope that you'll call us anytime you need us, and you have an open invitation back here anytime. So,
Oh, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
so that's it for our episode today. Erik, do you have any closing remarks? Did you prepare a speech to exit, or?
I did. It's thank you for listening. And in the wise words of Shawn Collins, like and subscribe. All right. See ya.
Thank you.
Yeah. The hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid.